Good evening, Digital Liberation Front. I'm Bradon Johnson, and today I am talking with Professor and author Tim Bakken, the author of The Cost of Loyalty, Dishonesty, Hubris, and Failure in the U.S. Military. Book just came out this year. It's a compelling read about the failure of the American military in regard to, gross expansion, isolation, violence. We're going to touch on, all that tonight. But welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much, Brandon.
So you were talking. I want you to elaborate, a little more about, the hierarchy. Well, first of all, let's talk about like how, this culture that we're dealing with now in regards to the military, came to be. Because we're talking about, it failing. So obviously at some point it must have, succeeded. And, it's not due to a lack of funds because, based off of what I read in your book, 20% of every dollar in this country goes to the U.S. military. So it's not a lack of money. They get more money than anything else. But something is preventing the military from being successful in regard to, winning conflicts. Now we're just in, long-term engagements all over the world. We haven't officially declared war since 1941, 1942, something
Right.
to that effect.
Right.
But, as you know, our military budget has been inflated. We've had numerous, if they aren't wars, we've had numerous violent encounters, all over the globe and on every single continent, save Antarctica. And I don't even know what could be possibly going on down there. We might be fighting penguins. But that being said, how did we get here, Tim? Like, what is going on?
After World War II, which was America's last successful war, the military developed within it. That hubris developed in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The military used the same kinds of strategies, but those strategies were singularly unsuccessful. To give an example of this, in all those wars from 1945 to today, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, the United States lost 100,000 soldiers, and we haven't had much success. But as significantly as that also, in all of those places, the number of civilians killed, and nobody really disagrees with this, nobody's sure, but nobody disagrees with the range, were killed. Then the military became more insular as it received more criticism, especially during the Vietnam War. In 1974, the US Supreme Court decided a case, Parker versus Levy. Levy was a captain in the Army who publicly disagreed with the Vietnam War. The Army then prosecuted Levy, convicted him, and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. He appealed to the Supreme Court, and formally, for the first time, the court in its Levy decision said that the military, quote, a separate society. As a result of that, soldiers do not have the right to speak freely in the military. We have very little information relative to information in civilian society, and we don't have enough information properly to make the military account for what it's doing anymore. On top of that, the military developed a criminal justice system that allows the commanders to issue charges. The commanders will select the jurors, and in many cases, the commanders, if somebody is found guilty, for example, may dismiss the charges against that person. That kind of concept is unknown, of course, in the civilian world, but it's emblematic of what's happening in the military, where the hierarchy takes over and people rise in the military because they like to be at the top of the hierarchy. That's not a way to run an organization. And I can give one little example about free speech or the lack of free speech in the military. There's a provision in the military's penal code, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that demands that soldiers not be disrespectful. And disrespectful, of course, can mean anything to anybody. And as a result of that, people are unwilling to speak up because the person above them, if he or she finds that something is disrespectful, that person can be criminally prosecuted for disrespect. And there's a provision that says the truth is not a defense in those circumstances. Therefore, if somebody in the military were to speak up and he or she were telling the truth, the result would be if that person were speaking disrespectfully, he or she could be prosecuted. That's just one way that the military controls everything inside the military. And I use that point to illustrate that the military is an institution that's very insular, very inside itself, and very unwilling to incorporate the modern norms of American civilian society. And after all, it's American civilian society that is supposed to control the military. The military should not be separate from that civilian society.
So we have, it's hierarchical, it's authoritarian, and then one other thing that stuck out to me in your book was, there's been a brain drain as far as command is concerned, where basically those individuals, who are put in those positions of authority, are not testing as high academically, but they're still they're being given more and more power, especially if you're talking about, the universities, like West Point, more money is being funneled into these universities where we're training these individuals, but not a lot is going into getting them, academically prepared for, leadership.
Yes, and I preface this by saying I have great respect for the military and the people who join the military, and in many respects, probably most respects, they are accomplished people. However, what happens once they arrive at the military, they encounter the society that I've described, the very insular society where people are not allowed to speak up at all, and everything becomes very conformist and controlling. And as a result of that, people, it's almost like leaving your car in parking lot Z. People start to leave their thinking and their critical thinking in parking lot Z and don't bring the car home at night. They just leave it there. And when that happens over a military career, say 20 years or 25 years, about the amount of time it takes someone to become a general, then by that point, that general has lost much of his or her ability to think critically. Put on top of that, which you were talking about, Brandon, an excellent point that the military receives 20 to 21%, maybe 22% of the federal budget every year. But then put on top of that, that's about 700 billion now every year. But what people don't realize, there's another maybe 400 or 500 billion spent on the military through the VA and also the Department of Energy. The VA, of course, takes care of soldiers' medical needs, and the Department of Energy runs the nuclear weapons programs in the United States. When you combine those programs with the regular budget of the Department of Defense, the money that we contribute, the Americans contribute 2 trillion. We could do a lot with 1.2 trillion, and certainly we should be, if we're in wars, and I'm not saying the 4 wars, or at least they should not have been fought as long as they were fought, if they should have been fought, that money has not been well spent. It has not returned victory for the United States. And I'm not saying that, as I said, the war should necessarily have been fought, especially in Vietnam and Iraq. But if the United States wants to engage in wars, the military has a responsibility to win those wars. Or, and this is what I emphasize in the cost of loyalty, the military cannot win the wars. And that might be a possibility because the wars are just too difficult to win. Then the military, the generals, have the responsibility to speak up and tell American society, but they have not done that. There has not been one general who has spoke up publicly in any of the 4 wars over 75 years and told us that we should withdraw from these wars because they are not winnable wars. even if the generals are capable. But the generals haven't shown that they are capable to lead us to success in those wars.
And that ties into, a passage that stuck out to me that, I screenshot, as I was reading. I just want to focus on that. It's basically what James Madison said in regard to, his fears about, an engorged, military that's unchecked. He said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. The same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war and the degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. So elaborate on that, on that passage.
Yeah, yes. During war, there are companies that have a vested interest in supplying the weapons of war. Of course, we need those companies to some extent. But over the course of 75 years, we've been at war probably half of those years, if we count Iraq and Afghanistan together. Over the course of those years, an enormous amount of American treasure, men and women and resources have been spent, and people have a vested interest in the continuance of the wars. As I mentioned, the costs of the wars are enormous, not just in terms of money, but of course in terms, more importantly, of the people who are lost and the people who are injured during the course of the wars. What is now becoming also a huge concern is that the military veterans have become a large part of American police forces around the United States. During the last few administrations, the presidential administrations, Bush, Obama, and Trump, the military has also given some of its military hardware to police forces around the country. The police have a very difficult job to do. It's an almost impossible job sometimes, but my perception, my point of view is that the military has taken on the approach and the ethos of the military, and the police have taken on the approach of the military. And as a result of that, we have an American society that is very militarized. And I mean militarized in the sense that the military ethos is within police officers and within police departments. And as a result of that, because the military is focused on overwhelming adversarial forces, the police departments and the police officers then also become focused on overcoming what they view as adversarial forces. When the job of anticipate, I believe, not perpetual war, that the military, whether they're police officers or military, have to learn to balance security with liberty and freedom of protest, etc. But unfortunately, our police forces, and I will always say they have a very difficult job, have taken on too much the military ethos. And in my view, that has created a tremendous conflict among our authority figures, police officers and others, and our citizens.
And so basically what we have is people who serve, they're brought into this authoritarian, violent, as you stated, atmosphere, given access, to weapons of war. And then, whenever they leave the military and they go into the private sector, they go and they work for our police forces, they carry over, they bring all of that. They bring that authoritarian mindset as, someone who has served. They bring those weapons of war, and, they bring that refusal to, challenge hierarchy. And so eventually they end up bringing the military to the population, to the civilian population, and they are military. They have a military approach to dealing with the population, as opposed to a civic-minded approach. They still have that battle.
As you mentioned, Brandon, the thing that I picked up was the thing that I've talked about in the book, and that is the hierarchical nature of the military. That hierarchical nature of the military is the most respected institution in America, has been brought into American civilian society, I believe, to the detriment of American civilian society. As a result of that, this hierarchy is now imbued within the thinking of police officers and police departments. If you see police chiefs on television, they're not often wearing suits and ties. They're wearing insignia with their rank, just like a military general would wear his or her insignia. That seeps down to create a culture in the policing apparatus of America of hierarchy. That hierarchy means that problems are solved by the authorities, not by devolving problems onto civilians to resolve them, but police officers believe that they have to overwhelm individuals in conflict situations. Because of that, we have more conflict rather than less conflict. But we need police officers, certainly, to confront tough situations, but we need them not to have a military ethos, not to be hierarchical, but rather to be more problem solving. The same can be said in the military. It should be a much flatter organization and much less hierarchical.
How does this play into how does this culture, this authoritarian top down, violent culture, play into some of the disappearances, some of the violence that we've seen, the disappearances of Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood, and she's not the only one. Like I said before, I have a friend of mine who was assaulted multiple times in the military, female, and she said, one of the sentiments among the military is, servicemen right now and some of the veterans is, why this is not something new. This is something that's been going on for a while in regard to violence against other servicemen and women in service, disappearances, deaths. How does this mentality play into, that phenomenon?
As I mentioned earlier, I think there might be a floor below which violence cannot be reduced in the military because of the hierarchical nature. One example that I've uncovered in my research, and this is based on two studies, one by the Pentagon, which does a sexual assault study of the military academies every other year, and the other study by the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, a federal agency. They have produced studies, and the sexual assault rate, for example, in the military academies compared to the sexual assault rate at civilian colleges, all civilian colleges in the country, 4-year, 2-year, etc., the sexual assault rate looks to be more than 5 times greater at the military academies. That doesn't seem to me to be an anomaly. The military has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last few years on trying to combat sexual assault, to its credit, but it still can't reduce the estimated number of sexual assaults below 20,000 or 25,000 every single year. It seems to me that the military has to look more deeply at its formal and informal structures and norms. Those are the kinds of things that allow people who would otherwise not to be free to commit violent acts. Second, we need to revise and probably reform and maybe even eliminate the military justice system, the military prosecutorial system. There are too many conflicts of interest. Everybody has a conflict of interest. Everybody is answerable to a commander. Nobody has the independence of prosecutors in civilian prosecutorial agencies in the United States today. As a result of that, we need independence in the justice system after we have the military disabusing itself of the hierarchical system and bringing back, or beginning to institute a more flatter society where there's not so much hierarchical control, one person over another person, every year, every day in the military. The goal of many people in the military is to have as much control over as many people as possible. That's a career goal. And while that might be somewhat acceptable, to have that as a main career goal, to have that hierarchical structure foisted on us in the military all the time, on military personnel, is doomed to create abusive situations.
So that oversight, because the military, is it's pretty much its own separate entity based off of the legal case you presented earlier. That division happened a long, long time ago. That oversight can only be done now by Congress.
Congress has to take control, yes, but even before Congress will take control, because military contractors, they're hired by the Pentagon, and they exist in every single congressional district in the country, 435, and they have enormous influence over members of Congress, the senators and the House of Representatives. Before Congress takes action, the American public needs to reevaluate its military and think about the end results. And the best way that I can explain in thinking about the military in a new way is to look at the results of the last 4 major wars, as I said, beginning with Korea. The results have been singularly disappointing. All those areas, Southeast Asia, Korea and Vietnam, the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, all those areas are more dangerous now. North Korea has nuclear weapons, Vietnam is communist, Iraq is controlled more by Iran than the United States, Afghanistan is controlled more by the Taliban than it was when the United States invaded in 2001, are more dangerous, are more detrimental to United States interests now than they were when the United States invaded. Americans need to look at that and consider why that's happened and understand that the military can no longer be beyond the scrutiny of Americans. It needs to be vastly reformed. It's a necessary institution, but the civilians have to bring back the military to civilian society and expect that it will be responsible to civilians and not responsible to only people within the military, within the hierarchy.
Well, one thing that stuck out to me that seemed to be a through line, in your book in regard to restoring some sense of, oversight, order, justice is basically, free speech. It's just like you said before, anything can be regarded as insubordination. So basically, the First Amendment rights of every single member in service, are basically signed away when you enlist. So if you see a sexual assault happening, and you want to report on it, there's the opportunity, or there's the chance, a great possibility that you're not going to be heard, that there will be retaliation, and not just on the level of low level sexual assaults that are happening. I hate to use the word low level in regard to sexual assaults, but not just in respect to sexual assaults that are happening at lower levels and lower ranks, but even whenever you get to whistleblowers like Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, and how he was treated and how he was retaliated against for reporting about the compromise of our government. You see First Amendment rights being trampled on over and over and over again. How do we fix that? How do you restore that? I know you have some experience with that, based off of teaching and some of the things that you saw in Russia when a spy plane was shot down. Talk to me a little bit about free speech.
I can give you an example. I was teaching in Russia just after the Soviet Union had disbanded, and the Russian Federation came into existence in 1997. I was teaching at a law school there in Yekaterinburg, which is in Eastern Russia. And I asked my students, what's the most valuable thing that they look at when they look at the United States, and they said free speech. But back in the United States, in the military and at the military academies, the three, Air Force, Navy, and Army, which is West Point, there is not the same respect for free speech. Rather, there's more focus on loyalty above truth and conformity over individuality. To some extent, that's necessary in any team endeavor, but in the military, which deals with the most serious issues, and we've not seen success, we need new ideas and we need the ability to speak up. Soldiers have to have that opportunity. I don't think there are very many soldiers in reality who, when the time comes to defend the nation, go to war, and be in combat, who will not follow an authority's orders, not follow an officer's decrees. I just don't think that exists very much. But what the military has done is to say, because we have to have great authority in times of combat, therefore we have to have similar great authority in all other situations, doesn't make any sense. Surgeons in an operating room have to have great authority, and when they're doing their jobs, nobody else speaks. We can have the same thing in combat, and once a surgeon is done with an operation, he or she goes back into the hospital, and the surgeon is equal to everybody else in the hospital staff. Yes, there's a bit of a hierarchy, but the abuse that occurs in the military, because the hierarchy never ends, cannot exist in any other place in American society. We have to understand that truth is more important than loyalty. Loyalty is necessary, yes, in every team endeavor, but truth has to be the umbrella which covers every other value.
And that loyalty talking point actually leads to what I'm going into next. Cover-ups, documented cover-ups, 500 cases among generals, admirals, and leaders. Talk to me about like how the cost of loyalty, as your book talks about. Like obviously integrity is one of those things, that is up there on the chopping block.
Let me just take some examples over the last 75 years, some of which Americans have familiarity with, some of which they don't. But I'll just try to make them very short. During the Korean War, Americans, and nobody disputes this anymore, killed, because they were scared, about 300 to 500 civilians at a bridge in No-Gun-Ri. The military, the Army especially, but also the Army Air Corps, believed that the people fleeing North Korea might be North Korean soldiers. And they shot them because they might be. They were in civilian clothes. That's not proper in any way. The military never reported that, and it was not uncovered until 1999 in an Associated Press report. Finally, the military had to agree that yes, this did happen. In the Vietnam War at My Lai, Lieutenant William Kelly, an American officer, and over 20 other soldiers killed about 500 women and children and older men while abusing them in 1968. That was not reported by Larry. It might have never been discovered if not for an independent reporter, Seymour Hersh, who found Callie not in Vietnam, but at a safe house at Fort Benning in Georgia while the Army was trying to decide what to do, a year and a half after the massacre had occurred. Those kinds of things have continued to go on in the military. The interesting recent example is one in Kunduz, Afghanistan. American soldiers in a gunship were directed to fly over what turned out to be a hospital and shoot at the structure for 30 to 60 minutes. Everybody agrees that they shot for at least 30 to 60 minutes, but everyone also agrees that they didn't intend to shoot at a hospital. They didn't want to kill, I think it was up to 42 or 44 patients, doctors, and nurses in the hospital. They didn't intend to kill in that situation. But because of mistakes by the US military, nonetheless, they shot at a hospital, receiving no return fire for 30 to 60 minutes. The Army, just Army, not any outside agency, conducted 2 investigations. And in the investigations, they concluded that there was no intentional killing. But that's not the issue. Just imagine if police officers in the United States encircled a hospital or building and shot for 30 to 60 minutes, and not one of them would be held criminally responsible. But that's what happened in the case of the Cadiz hospital incident. The Army found that 16 officers and soldiers were responsible, but nobody was prosecuted in that case. And to me, the most remarkable thing that shows the military is beyond the control of the civilian world is that the Army refused to name the officers and soldiers who were responsible for killing those 42 people. That would be not only unacceptable, but it would be unimaginable in any other public organization for us not to know who was responsible for killing 42 people in that kind of circumstance. And the military did not even consider whether these were negligent killings. They just said because they weren't intentional, there was no intent to kill doctors, nurses, and patients, and nobody disagrees with that. There could be no criminal responsibility in that case. The military is able to do that because it is beyond the reach of civilian society. As I said, and I'll try to emphasize it just one more time, it's unimaginable that any other public agency could get away with not even telling us that members in that agency who were responsible for killing 42 completely innocent people. They didn't do it intentionally, but they did it because of mistakes in the organization, mistakes in the Army.
And because of the decline in intellectual, because of the decline of an intellectual environment, the chances of those mistakes happening increase significantly. I want to change gears a little bit and talk a bit about, go back to, the kinds of people that, we're allowing, into the military. The standards have dropped significantly, where we're allowing, former felons and whatnot to come in. And I mentioned that not because of the fact that, I feel like, there should be, they shouldn't be allowed in the military necessarily, but whenever you're talking about bringing people in who have a violent past into a violent environment that is authoritarian, that is hierarchical, you're nurturing that violence, and then also you're also facilitating what we're seeing right now. There was an investigation in law enforcement and in the military, which found that law enforcement and the military, had been basically infiltrated by white supremacists. And a lot of what you stated tonight and what I read in your book, ties right into that. There's a rise of authoritarianism in this country. There's a rise of white supremacy in this country. There's a rise of violence in this country. And the militarization of law enforcement, feeds that fire, feeds that flame. What are your thoughts?
One of the points that I made in the book was not my own point, and it's not my research, so I have to give credit for it to a professor, an anthropologist named Hugh Gusterson. Professor Gusterson looked back, and I think it's over 30 years, from 1984 maybe to 2015, at the mass killings in the United States that were done by adults. There have been mass killings by children in the United States, unfortunately, but he looked at the number of mass killings by adults because children can't enlist in the military, only adults can enlist in the military. And he found that 33% of the mass killings had been done by veterans of the military, unfortunately. And he said, and this was just his reasoning, and I'm not saying that I know the answer, but maybe it reinforces what you said, Brandon, that there are really two conclusions only that can be reached. Either the people who are entering the military have a propensity toward violence, or the military is training people in such a way that they are violent outside the context of war. The reality is, very few people, a small percentage, ever see combat. The military, therefore, has to be responsible for training and educating soldiers not to take whatever they learn in the military into civilian society, the violence that they learn in the military. And we train the military to be violent in some instances when they have to fight our wars. The military is not doing a good job, as you said, either of selecting who becomes someone in the military or training them, educating them not to be violent once they go back into civilian society. We have a problem in the military with that. And Gusterson, the professor, seems to indicate that the responsibility falls on the military. It's just not a coincidence that those mass killings are done disproportionately by military veterans.
We also are seeing an increase in nationalism, which ties into, you know, what you're talking about as far as glorifying, you know, violence, glorifying the military industrial complex, you know, as opposed to recognizing yourself as being part of you know, a serving arm. How do we bring that back? Like, how do we rein that back in? You know, now that we've separated the military effectively from, you know, civilian life, you know, how do we accomplish that reintegration?
It's very difficult because of what happened between the world wars and after World War II. The military developed values of loyalty and patriotism and obedience above all other values for a lot of reasons, I suppose. But as I talk about, and Brandon, you mentioned this, one of the parts of the book is on hubris. The military developed a hubris and said that we seem to know more about anything than anybody else, and we can win any war that we enter. That kind of hubris led the military to think that we might be right in everything we do, and therefore everybody should value patriotism and loyalty above everything else. In this country today, as I reported in the book, this occurs every year. Americans have more faith in the military than any other institution. That's ironic because the military has had less success in its missions in the 4 wars that I talked about than probably any other American institution. And I believe a result of that is we see all the flyover. The American public has become attuned to accept and loyalty, and maybe, as you're saying, Brandon, nationalism are the values that are preeminent. If that's the case, and I've argued this in the military, it is the case, then loyalty is more important than truth. And the loyalty that people feel is not loyalty to the principles of the Constitution, to free speech, which we've been talking about tonight, to truth, which is necessary, argument, which is necessary to reach good results and to make good judgments. Loyalty then is overcoming all of that. And what it is in the guise of is patriotism. People will say America is the most exceptional country in the history of the world. Well, our problems today show that we don't fare very well against some of the other countries in the world right now. And my view is that part of that is a focus on patriotism and loyalty over truth, over problem solving, over addressing the critical things that are more likely to cause death, disease, and disheartened Americans than military problems. We need to refocus on where our problems are rather than to continue to pour money into a military that is not winning our wars.
Well, considering the instability that's growing, I mean, like, you know, the western part of, you know, the country is on fire. You know, we see climate change, you know, is making things more contentious all around the globe. You know, is there, you know, a way to, I guess, like, you know, push back against, you know, this authoritarianism that seems to have crept out of the military into civilian life, where, you know, basically we have a very polarized society that focuses on, just like you said, loyalty to, you know, party over facts, over reason, over logic, that bleed over, you know, is affecting us across the board. So what would be your antidote? Solve all of our problems, Tim.
Well, the antidote has to be understanding what's happening. And I've touched on that, understanding that our problems cannot be solved through military intervention, and they cannot be solved by pouring money into the military. Let me give one example with the pandemic, and maybe it's more than one example. As you may recall, at the beginning of the pandemic, the problem center was New York City. At one time in New York City, I would walk around Central Park and I could see the COVID tents, the white COVID tents that were placed there by an evangelical Christian organization because New York didn't have enough hospital space. Then I walked down the west side of New York City where the Navy ship, the Comfort, was docked because it was designed to provide beds for COVID patients or beds for patients who didn't have COVID but didn't have any other place to go. I continued walking and made my way to what's known as the Javits Convention Center, also on the west side of New York City. At the Javits Convention Center, the Army had taken over and converted the convention center into a hospital for COVID patients. The point is that when we were in a tough situation with the pandemic in New York City, we didn't have enough civilian resources to take care of our own people. People think of New York City as a grand place, and it is in many respects, many times, but we couldn't take care of our own American citizens with our civilian resources. We had to turn to the military. Until we say that the military has had enough and we turn our attention to giving more resources, and Americans have to do this, they have to push Congress to do this, to our civilian institutions, and maybe say to the military, you have to take a little less for a while, then we're not going to have success. We just have to reprioritize, but it can only come through programs like this one and interviews like this, where we discuss things that are not just in the military, are not discussed in Congress, because, as I've said, as you've recognized, the focus in the military and in Congress with regard to the military is on patriotism, dispassionate, critical thinking, and over understanding what the truth might be, because that's just not a value. It's that is higher than loyalty, and that has become a problem for us.
Well, I hope we get this all figured out before Space Force is deployed and we have to deal with this craziness falling from the sky. But I thank you for your time tonight, Dr. Bakken. I'd love to have you back, to talk as things continue to unfold over, these next couple months, because I truly believe, the military is going to play a big role as we face some of these greater issues, like climate change, and hoping that, if things turn out, to the public's benefit in November, we can start to address these things. But I thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks for inviting me, Brandon. Thanks for your questions and our discussion.
Once again, Professor Tim Bakken, the cost of loyalty, dishonesty, hubris, and failure in the U.S. military. Go and check it out now. Thank you so much for tuning into the Digital Liberation Front.